Ah, the 1810s, the days of Beethoven, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, bombs bursting in air over Baltimore Harbor, Tambora bursting over everybody's summer plans, many a Latin American War of Independence, and Colin Firth emerging like Excalibur from the ponds of England. While the powers of Europe wondered whether the sixth time would be the charm to stop the Napoleonic craze sweeping the continent, clear across the world the stage was being set for one of the stupidest, one of the most pathetic, and one of the most truly random of conflicts to befall the Pacific that century. A historical crossover so ambitious that few YouTubers have dared to tread into its rake field of facepalms. To the Russians of the day, it was known as the Hawaiian Spectacular, but to history, it is remembered as This shipwreck of a story begins, appropriately enough, with a shipwreck. Caught in a storm on the evening of January 30th, 1815, the Bering ran aground southwest of Hawaii's island of Kauai. The Bering was a merchant ship belonging to the Russian-American Company, a chartered company based out of Russian America, or Alaska as it's now known, under the supreme patronage of His Imperial Majesty Tsar Alexander I. Think sort of like the British or Dutch East India Companies, part commercial endeavor, part colonial endeavor. The Hawaiians and Russians had had passing contact with one another for about 10 years at this point, following the first Russian circumnavigation of the globe in 1803 to 1806. And the Bering, under the command of American Captain James Bennett, had been tasked with bringing about 100,000 rubles worth of furs and other goods to trade with the Hawaiians in exchange for food they would bring to Russian outposts on the west coast of North America. Now in 1815, Kauai was ruled by a man named Kaumuali'i. Captain Bennett reached an agreement with Kaumuali'i that he and his crew would be given a place to stay until their rescue in exchange for Kauai being able to keep the remains of the Bering. However, according to Bennett, possibly due to subterfuge or possibly just a simple miscommunication, the Hawaiians seized both the ship and its contents, including not just the furs and trade goods, but its cannons and weapons as well. The crew of the Bering eventually managed to hitch a ride with another ship arriving at Novoarkhangelsk, Alaska, modern-day Sitka, and relaying their story to Russian-American Company colonial governor Alexander Baranov. Despite Bennett and others asking Baranov to organize an expedition to return and seize the cargo by force, Baranov opted for a slightly more tactful mission. Baranov initially sought the captain of a ship called the Suvorov to negotiate the return of the goods. However, due to some sort of falling out between the two, Baranov instead ended up commissioning the Suvorov's ship doctor to command another vessel, the Isabella, to head to Hawaii and act as envoys of the Russian-American Company. That doctor was a man named Georg Anton Schäffer. So, who was this Dr. Schäffer, and what experience had prepared him for some hard-nosed haggling in Hawaii? Well, Schäffer himself was neither Russian nor American, but a Franconian German from Bavaria. The son of a distillery owner, a surgeon by trade, and an expert polyglot, Schäffer had participated in the War of the Sixth Coalition against Napoleon's forces on behalf of Russia. Despite this, he had no known military, naval, or diplomatic education. According to writer and historian Lee Croft, quote, Schäffer's efforts back in Russia in its war against France came in the form of trying to construct, and I swear this is a direct quote, a shark-shaped, hydrogen-filled, rotor-wing-powered balloon from which to drop time-fuse explosives on invading forces ahead of the Battle of Borodino. And if that doesn't qualify you for every job on the face of the earth, I don't know what does. With the Isabella ready to set sail, Baranov gave Schäffer a clear set of instructions. But in order to understand them, we need to take a quick rewind and look at where things stand from the Hawaiian perspective. So, as of 1815, Hawaii was not a 100% unified kingdom under a single sovereign ruler. Kaumuali'i, who we already met, had ruled over Kauai and Niihau to the west since 1794. Meanwhile, the remainder of the islands were under the rule of one of the most famous and powerful Hawaiians that century, Kamehameha I. You might know him from the 9-foot 10-inch bronze and gold leaf statue that Hawaii gave to the U.S. Capitol, clocking in at a cool 15,000 pounds or 6.8 metric tons. Kamehameha was something of a force of nature whose conquest of all Hawaii felt inevitable at the time that the young Kaumuali'i took the throne. In 1796, just a year after he conquered neighboring Oahu, Kamehameha set his sights on Kauai, bringing a force of 10,000 soldiers to bear against the island, with the 18-year-old Kaumuali'i and his mother leading the defense with just a small force and a handful of guns and cannons at their disposal. But if there's anything that can stop a force of nature, it's another force of nature, and a sudden storm ended up sparing Kauai's fate for the time being. In 1803, Kamehameha attempted another invasion, but this time was repelled by yet another force of nature: disease. By the end of the decade, Kamehameha had given up his attempts to conquer the island by brute force, and considered some more diplomatic means at getting that "the Great" added to the end of his name. In 1810, Kaumuali'i and Kamehameha reached an agreement where Kaumuali'i would continue to govern Kauai and Niihau as a semi-independent vassal and, upon his death, would turn over control of the islands to Kamehameha, fully uniting the Hawaiian archipelago under Kamehameha's rule. For both rulers, the agreement was a means of avoiding bloodshed, as Kaumuali'i knew he wouldn't be able to mount a force on his own to stand up to Kamehameha's. But he did know that this agreement would give him precious time, and Kaumuali'i hoped, with that extra time, maybe a miracle would fall into his lap. Well, part one of that miracle happened 5 years later when the Bering happened to wreck just off his shore, complete with guns, cannons, and ammunition on board, and a desperate crew in need of rescue. Part two of that miracle, as fate would have it, was about to set sail from Alaska. When Dr. Georg Schäffer departed Novo-Arkhangelsk, he received the following instructions. He was to travel to Oahu and demand Kamehameha recoup the Russian-American company's losses from the Bering with payments in the form of sandalwood, a valuable plant used in both furniture and perfume making, to use this arrangement to establish a Russian monopoly on the sandalwood market in Hawaii, and to get Kamehameha's approval to allow Russia a permanent presence on the islands that they could use to sell Alaskan furs in China. Schäffer brought with him a letter from Baranov establishing his credentials, gifts to assist in negotiations, and the threat, but just the threat for now, that Russia may consider taking Kauai by force if they didn't get their way. Now, bear in mind, communications between Hawaii and Alaska in the 1810s were slow, and communications between Hawaii and the Russian government in St. Petersburg were even slower. If anything didn't go to plan, it would be up to Shark Balloon Bomb Boy to improvise a solution. And improvise he would. Schäffer and the Isabella arrived at Oahu in November 1815 with a diverse crew of Russians, Americans, and of course the German at the helm. Soon after, another Russian ship, the Otkritie, under the command of a Lieutenant Podushkin, arrived at Kauai. While Podushkin had been given instructions to avoid violence if possible, the second Russian ship sent a signal that the Russian-American company meant business. But when Schäffer met with Kamehameha, he ran into a problem. You see, Russia was not the only country trying to game their way at influence in Hawaii. 2 years after Kamehameha and Kaumuali'i reached their agreement over the islands, the United Kingdom and a fledgling United States had entered the War of 1812, with Hawaii becoming something of a proxy to that conflict. The Americans had aligned themselves with Kaumuali'i, allowing him to stop paying tribute to Kamehameha, as he was required to under the terms of his agreement. The Americans largely abandoned Kauai in 1814, leaving both Kaumuali'i and America's interests on the island exposed to threats from the outside. Meanwhile, both the United States and the United Kingdom maintained a trading and diplomatic presence on the islands ruled by Kamehameha. One Briton, John Young, had served as both an advisor and an interpreter for Kamehameha, rising through the ranks and gaining his trust. Americans, Brits, and locals began speculating whether Russia truly wanted just a refund for their ship and maybe access to a nice harbor, or if they wanted to make Hawaii into the next Alaska and bring it under the control of the Tsar. Young reportedly relayed these concerns to Kamehameha, much to the annoyance of Schäffer, who was unable to so much as get Kamehameha to read Baranov's diplomatic letter. Schäffer, however, had an ace up his sleeve, and used his medical expertise to treat one of Kamehameha's wives, Ka'ahumanu, who had fallen seriously ill. This was enough to earn him and his crew a piece of land which they could use to farm and trade. According to Schäffer, the Americans and Brits were none too pleased with this arrangement, and the other foreigners even plotted to have him killed, although we only have Schäffer's word for that. By the late spring, early summer of 1816, further negotiations had stalled. Another Russian ship had arrived at Hawaii, and despite the new posse backing him up, Schäfer's next meeting with Kamehameha was unsuccessful at gaining additional concessions for Russia. That May, Schäfer and most of his crew left Oahu and headed west to Kauai to try their luck with Kaumuali'i instead, leaving a small group on Oahu to man the property they had been allowed to develop. And this meeting in Kauai is where both men struck gold. Kaumuali'i not only compensated Schäfer for the content of the bearing, not only offered the Russian-American company their sandalwood monopoly and the chance to build forts on Kauaian land, but, dressed in the uniform of a Russian naval officer, raised the flag of the Russian-American company, and straight up pledged his loyalty and his kingdom to the Russian Empire and Tsar Alexander I. There was only one catch. Russia would need to defend its new imperial possession from outside threats, including Kamehameha, who had already been promised control of Kauai and Niihau after the death of Kaumuali'i. But, whether supremely confident, blinded by the delicious bait that had been dangled in front of him, or some combination of both, Schäfer immediately accepted the pact. Schäfer joyously wrote 2 letters, one to the Russian-American Company in Novoarkhangelsk, and the other to the Russian government in St. Petersburg, informing the company of their new goods and sandalwood monopoly, and the imperial government of their new holding, and their obligations to defend the tiny island on the other side of the world from military threats. Schäfer might have imagined a hero's reception for his gift to the crown of Russia, or maybe he managed to temper his expectations, but bottom line, his letters wouldn't arrive at Novoarkhangelsk for several weeks at the quickest, and wouldn't reach St. Petersburg for even longer. Regardless of what their responses would be, the decision had now been made without their consultation, and without Russia any the wiser of the sudden new conflict that their country had just joined. Still, Schäfer and crew started to plan for what they soon realized could become a full-blown armed conflict over the Hawaiian Islands. And it's at this point that, according to historian Nikolai Bolkhovitnikov, Schäfer's grip on reality seems to be, well, troubled. What had been a pledge of defense quickly started to slide into a fantasy of conquest. Schäfer soon agreed to a second, secret treaty with Kaumuali'i, with the latter pledging 500 soldiers to a Russian-led takeover of Kamehameha's lands, including Oahu, Maui, and all the Hawaiian Islands east of Kauai. Through these holdings, Schäfer claimed, the Chinese will have to allow the Russian flag to wave in Canton. The English and Americans will have their trade cut off. The Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, must be made a Russian West India and a second Gibraltar. Russia must have these islands at any cost. No power in the world has more rights to these islands than Russia. Schäfer started to buy whatever warships he could get his hands on, expensed, of course, to his employer, the Russian-American Company. Schäfer's men built 2 forts on the north end of Kauai on Hanalei Bay in an area that Schäfer, ever the creative, named Schäferthal, or Schäfer's Valley. The Kauaian locals, now in Schäfer's eyes effectively vassals of Russia, also constructed a star fort near Waimea named Pa'ulaula, or Red Enclosure, a structure which you can still see today. Schäfer instead named the structure Fort Elizabeth after the Tsar's wife, and claimed it too as a Russian fort, despite Kaumuali'i almost certainly having built the fort for himself. Before long, though, Schäfer got a response from Baranov at Novoarkhangelsk. No, a military conquest of Kamehameha's territory would not be official Russian policy, and, to add insult to injury, the Russian-American Company would not be reimbursing him for all those warships he had just bought. But Schäfer, ever the savvy strategist, decided to just, not tell anyone about Baranov's response. So, when a new Russian Imperial Navy ship arrived in December with 400 men on board, Kamehameha took it as a dire warning, as did the British and Americans in the area. In fact, this new ship had nothing at all to do with Schäfer's plans, and didn't so much as stop by Kauai for tea. Despite, or perhaps because of assurances from this ship's captain that he was not there to support Schäfer, a group of Americans stormed what remained of Schäfer's lands on Oahu, forcing his men to leave. And the foreigners didn't stop there. The British and Americans offered Kamehameha their own forces to defend his realm from Kaumuali'i, and bought up all available sandalwood they could get their hands on, along with all the salt and food, aiming to starve Schäfer out. Despite all this, Schäffer managed to hang on in Kauai until May 1817. Kaumuali'i was becoming increasingly frustrated with Schäffer, who by now had drawn the ire of 3 nations to Kauai, not to mention crashed the local economy while trying to make himself the de facto ruler of the island. Schäffer's diverse crew were also becoming more and more fractured, with some of his American charges defecting to, well, the Americans. For their part, the Americans were pulling out both the carrots and the sticks and threatening Kaumuali'i with death unless he ditched Schäffer for good. Enter George Young, another American who was the captain of another Russian-American company ship called the Kadyak. The Kadyak was not a great warship. In fact, from what I can tell, it sounds like kind of a pile of trash. But at least it floated. Mostly. Captain Young, whether out of loyalty or opportunism, aligned himself with the increasingly unallied Schäffer and offered him safe passage out of Kauai. In May 1817, the day came when Kaumuali'i had had enough of Schäffer's shenanigans, and, with a force of thousands of soldiers, drove him off the island. Schäffer escaped on the Kadyak, unable to take his weapons with him, but, in an act of poetry becoming of a George Lucas prequel, the leaky Kadyak ended up running aground, this time in Oahu, right off the shore of Kamehameha. Schäffer is quoted as recounting, "There was no way we could oppose our enemies. Our forces were weak." Schäffer, as it turns out, was able to make his escape, on board an American ship, the Panther. It may or may not surprise you to hear that this escape plan only accounted for himself, and 64 members of his crew remained stranded on Oahu throughout the rest of 1817 and into 1818. Meanwhile, for his part, Kaumuali'i's gamble with Schäffer did pay off in a way. When a joint American-British-Hawaiian force attempted to seize Kauai the next month, he was able to use the weapons that Schäffer had left behind to repel the attack. By total happy coincidence, it was also around this time that Schäffer's letter to the Russian crown informing them of their new vassal state in the Pacific finally reached St. Petersburg. As it turns out, they were less than amused with an employee of a state company attempting to conquer a kingdom by force without their permission while Europe had just managed to finally restore some degree of peace and balance in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. The dream of Russian Hawaii was officially dead. So what became of Schäffer? Well, after he left Hawaii, he managed to regroup with some of his fellow evacuees from the Kadyak and head first to Macau, then to Rio de Janeiro, then back to Europe. He maintained his desire to conquer Hawaii for Russia, but the Russian state, like most everyone else in the story, had become fed up with Schäffer and ended up suing him for their losses from his misadventures. They eventually settled on the matter, and Schäffer took up a new project, founding the first German colony in Brazil, known as Frankenthal, in 1821. And, in classic Schäffer fashion, ran afoul of Emperor Dom Pedro I, trying to get cushy appointments back in Europe. Schäffer lived out the rest of his years in Brazil, and died in Jacarandá in 1836. And Kaumuali'i? Well, as it turns out, he ended up outliving Kamehameha, who passed away in 1819. Following Kamehameha's death, his widow, Ka'ahumanu, the same woman that Schäffer had treated all those years ago, held significant power. After Kamehameha's son, Kamehameha II, and Ka'ahumanu effectively kidnapped Kaumuali'i in 1821, he was made to marry Ka'ahumanu and ensure the union of the two kingdoms. The couple never had any children, and Kaumuali'i died just a few years later at the age of 46, thus officially uniting Hawaii under the line of Kamehameha. Kaumuali'i's body was reburied several times, most recently when he was moved to the Waiola'a Church graveyard in 1884. Sadly, this church was one of the casualties of the wildfires that ravaged Lahaina in 2023. And even if Kaumuali'i didn't completely succeed in keeping his kingdom independent, I think it has to be said for someone who became king as a teenager facing off against at least 4 different powers that wanted his islands, the fact that he managed to hold off Kamehameha, the Russians, the Americans, the British, and one pesky German for all those years shouldn't be forgotten. Before you go, I want to acknowledge Jorge Alvarez, whose article, How a German Tried to Conquer Hawaii for the Russian Empire, provided the most comprehensive account of this story in English. I have it linked in the description, and my other sources are listed here. For an event with very difficult to access primary source materials, these secondhand accounts are absolutely invaluable to a no-budget production like this one. Be sure to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.